Good morning, kings and queens, and happy Monday. It's a brand new week, and we're going to jump into Math 7, Unit 1. This is going to be Lesson 3A. Of course, just a quick reminder because it is Monday, our classroom norms are that your cameras are on, your mics are muted, and that you guys are ready to chat and share out. So for today's class, there are some new things that we're going to need, but we'll pay attention to that in just a second. So again, these materials are needed for class and are extremely important. It's imperative that you have your Math 7 spiral notebook, a pencil, and for today's lesson, you need the student companion. This student companion is brand new. It can be found in Google Classroom. This is how you will receive a classwork grade. So what I need you guys to do now is to open up a tab in your browser and go to Google Classroom and then open up the assignment that says Student Companion for today's class. Throughout the lesson, you will type your answers in that Student Companion and then submit at the end of the live session, and that's how you will get credit for today's class. So in your journal, we're going to label today's date. Today is September 21st, 2020. And at the bottom of the page, we're going to label it page 5. So today we're going to talk about representing proportional relationships with tables. Again, this is day 1. We're introducing proportional relationships with tables. So today, the first thing that we're going to copy down in our journals on page 5 is the standard 7.rp.2a and 7.rp.2b. Our objectives will be students will comprehend that the phrase proportional relationship in spoken and written language refers to when two quantities are related by multiplying by a constant of proportionality. We're also going to describe orally and in writing relationships between rows or between columns in a table that represents a proportional relationship. And then lastly, we're going to explain orally how to calculate missing values in a table that represents a proportional relationship. This, for today's lesson, our mathematical practices are MP6, which is attend to precision, and MP7, which means look for and make use of structure. Again, for today's class, we need to make sure that we're ready to take notes and also work collaboratively. Those two things are going to be extremely important. So let's pause the video here just for 2 minutes to make sure that you copy down these standard and objectives on page 5 of your interactive notebook. Now that we've had a chance to copy this down, let's jump into our engagement activity for today. So our engagement is paper towels by the case. So here's a table that shows how many rows of paper towels a store receives when they order different numbers of cases. So I want you guys to take a minute to yourselves quietly. So I want you guys to look at this table, and your job is to think of at least one thing that you notice and one thing that you wonder. Okay. So quietly, I want you guys to think of one thing that you notice from this table and one thing that you wonder. Okay. We're going to pause the video here for a second. And when you are ready, after you've come up with your one thing that you notice and one thing that you wonder, I want you guys to give us a thumbs up. So now that you guys have had some time to think, I want you guys to put some of the things that you noticed in the chat. So for instance, go ahead and say I notice and then blank. And then I also want you to write down in the chat what you noticed. After that, I would love for at least 2 of you guys to share out what it is that you noticed and that you wondered from this table. So let's go ahead and pause once again so that you guys can type in the chat one thing that you noticed and one thing that you wondered, and then we're going to have 2 of you all share out. So some additional things and also things that you mentioned, hopefully you realize that this table has 2 columns. One title says the number of cases they order. The other column says number of rolls of paper towels that are in that case. You guys might have realized that in order to go from one row to another, you multiply the columns by the same number. So for instance, if I multiply 1 times 12, I get 12, or 3 times 12, I get 36, or 5 times 12 gives me 60. You also might realize to find the number of rows that you multiply the number of cases by 12, like we just stated. Or for instance, each from 1 to 3, it increased by 2. From 12 to 36, it increased by 24. If I went from 5 to 10, I multiplied by 2. 60 times 2 gives me 120. We also noticed that there are 12 rows in each case. Okay, so there are a number of different things that we could have just figured out from this table in general. Okay, but some things that I wonder, we might have wondered, how much does each case cost, or how many paper towels are on a roll, or why would you even need 120 paper towels in general? So we're going to think like this as we move through this lesson and talk about how we can find out different information from a table. So now let's take some time to solve problems involving proportional relationships using tables. And as you can see in that nice GIF, we're going to change that seat into a nice little table. Okay, so let's talk about today's goals. So we want to be able to make sure that there are some things that we can accomplish before we actually wrap up today's lesson. So we want to understand the following terms: proportional relationship and constant of proportionality. And then we also want to make sure that I can use a table to reason about two quantities, that just means two numbers, that are in a proportional relationship. So we want to be able to find the missing quantities from a table, and then also be able to discuss those two vocabulary words: proportional relationship and constant of proportionality. So let's dive right into our exploration activity. So our exploration activity for today is going to be called feeding a crowd. So what I need you guys to do now is to make sure that you also have your student companion ready. So if you can kind of do a split screen, or as long as you have your student companion where you can type in it at this point, you'll be good to go, because we're going to allow some independent work time before we start to share out. So we're going to begin this activity with some quiet work time, about 5 minutes, okay? And then we're going to be prepared to share out your ideas with the class. So once again, this is what we're going to do. At this point, you should have open your student companion, and we're going to scroll to the second page where the title says Exploration Feeding a Crowd. So there are only two questions that you guys are responsible for answering. You guys are responsible for number one and number two, and also completing the table. So we're going to pause this video for about 5 minutes so that everybody has a chance to go ahead and complete the exploration portion of this activity. Once that 5 minutes is up, we're going to regroup as a class and share together. All right. Now that you've had some time to enter your answers in the student companion, we're going to go back and also share out amongst the class. So at this time, if you want to answer some of these questions, just go ahead and raise your hand and then unmute yourself. That way we can answer these questions. So the first part in the student companion, number one, it says a recipe says that 2 cups of dry rice, so in the table we have 2 cups of dry rice, will serve 6 people. So 2 cups of rice serves 6 people. Part A tells me how many people will 10 cups of rice serve, and we want to figure that out. So let's pause the video, and I'm going to ask that somebody shares out how many people will 10 cups of rice serve. So now that you all have had a chance to go ahead and share out, hopefully you guys realize that 10 cups of rice serves 30 people. Now let's also have somebody share out how many cups of rice are needed to serve 45 people. And again, yes, it takes 15 cups of rice to serve 45 people. And again, we could have gotten that from realizing that if I multiplied all of the numbers in the cups of rice column by 3, I get the number of people that it serves. So 2 times 3 serves 6 people. 3 times 3 gives me 9. 10 times 3 gives me that answer of 30 that I was looking for. And then 15 times 3 gives me 45. So in this case, I could have divided 45 by 3 to get my answer of 15. If there are any other ways that you all figured this out, go ahead and share out at this point. Now we'll pause the video to give anybody another chance to share out if they found another method to fill out this table. All right, so moving right along, now that we've figured that out, let's go back to number 2. Number 2 says that a recipe says that 6 spring rolls will serve 3 people. And you guys were responsible for filling out this table. Now, because we went over the first example, we're going to leave number 2 alone so that we can grade this in your journals. But if you need a second to go back and revise your answer based off of number 1, now that you kind of understand, let's take about 2 minutes to figure out and make sure that our answers for number 2 are completely correct. So we're going to pause the video just for about 2 seconds, 2 minutes, and then make sure that our answer for number 2 is correct. All right, let's keep moving right along. So one of the vocabulary words that we needed to talk about is, what is a proportional relationship? So this is going to be perfect to put into our notes. So let's make sure that we're writing this down. So the first thing that we need to know about a proportional relationship is that when two quantities are always in equivalent ratios. So proportional relationships are when two quantities are always in equivalent ratios. So the relationship between the number of cups of rice and the number of people in the last example was a proportional relationship. And that just means that we can say the number of cups of rice is proportional to the number of people. So we're going to pause the video here so that we can make sure that we have our definition of a proportional relationship. And that simply means when two quantities are always in equivalent ratios. And we can copy down these examples because we're going to have access to our student companions from today. All right, thank you so much for copying that down. Now, it's time for our explanation activity. So now we're going to go back to our student companion and also jot down some more information. So our explanation activity is making bread dough, okay? So this problem says a bakery uses 8 tablespoons of honey for every 10 cups of flour to make bread dough. So we're going to begin this activity with some quiet work time, about 3 minutes, for you guys to go ahead and complete the table and then also the questions that are listed there, 1, 2, 3, and 4 in your student companion. So let's take about 3 minutes where we're going to pause this video and then we're going to do the work in our student companion. We're now on page 3 of the student companion where it says explanation making bread dough. Okay, so let's read the directions together as you're on the student companion. It says some days they bake bigger batches and some days they bake smaller batches, but they always use the same ratio of honey to flour. Remember, the ratio was 8 tablespoons of honey for every 10 cups. So we're going to complete the table as you answer the questions and then be prepared to explain your reasoning. So again, we're going to pause the video. You have 3 minutes, and then we're going to be prepared to share your ideas with the class. Now, let's share out some of our ideas with the class. So these were a little bit more difficult to figure out because the numbers don't necessarily follow a pattern, or it might be a little bit hard to follow because they're not in order. So the first question was, how many cups of flour do they use with 20 tablespoons of honey? Hopefully you realize for 20 tablespoons of honey, they would need 25 cups of flour. And one way that I could have gotten that was because it's hard to figure out how can I go from 8 to 20. But let's take half of that, for instance. If I take half of 8, you guys should know that that's 4, right? And if I take half of 10, that gives me 5. So 4 tablespoons of honey, I would use 5 cups of flour. Well, there is a way to get from 4 to 20. I would just have to multiply by 5. 4 times 5 gives me 20. So on the other side, if I use 4 tablespoons of honey for 5 cups of flour, 5 times 5 gives me 25. Okay. So that's one way to figure that out. So again, your answer was 25. Let's pause the video here and have any other students share how they figured out how to get the missing amount for number one. Now that we've kind of figured out different methods to figure this out, let's take some time and refine our answers. Number two asks us, how many cups of flour do they use with 13 tablespoons of honey? So, what's a way that I can kind of figure this out? Let's see if we can go back and refine our answers. I'm not going to give you the answer to this one just because we need some things to grade, but let's take some time to refine our answer and share out some strategies amongst our classmates. And now let's answer number three. Number three says, how many tablespoons of honey do they use with 20 cups of flour? Now, hopefully, you noticed that this one was an easier pattern to follow because if I take my original ratio of 8 tablespoons of honey and 10 cups of flour, all I have to do is double 10 to get to 20 in this last row. So the same thing needs to happen for honey. If I double it, I would get how much honey I need. So for 20 cups of flour, I would just need 16 tablespoons of honey. Now, some of you guys also may have mentioned that I could also figure out how much do I have if I have 1 tablespoon of honey and how much flour that would be. Whenever I figure out that one space, that's going to be called our constant of proportionality. So that's what we need to talk about a little bit further. So let's jump into some other approaches that support completing the actual table. So if you notice here, I have a number of different models at the top, and I also have a number line of how I can kind of figure out what some of my missing values were. So again, I'm not obviously if I'm not making anything, I'm starting with 0 tablespoons of honey and 0 tablespoons of flour. Now, 8 tablespoons and 10 cups was given to me. But again, if I wanted to split this up a little bit more evenly, I could have taken half, which would have given me 4. And then half of 10 cups of flour would have given me 5, which would have helped me figure out the numbers between 0 and 5. Also, if I increased 8 by 4, it would have given me 12. And because if I increased my tablespoons of honey by 4, I had to increase my cups of flour by 5. So if you notice, the top part of my number line is increasing by 4s, and the bottom part of my number line is increasing by 5s. So, as promised, we need to talk more about what is a constant of proportionality. So, once again, we're going back to our journals and we're copying down this definition. So, a constant of proportionality is a constant ratio, also known as a unit rate, which we talked about before in sixth grade. So, a constant ratio or a unit rate in any proportional relationship. So it can always be found by finding how much of the second quantity per one of the first quantity. So that means that we always want to figure out if I only want one of my first quantities, how much am I going to have of the second quantity? So in the bread dough activity, the constant of proportionality was 1 and 25 hundredths. So we can multiply any amount of honey by 1.25 to find the amount of flour that's needed. So let's go back. That simply means that for 1 tablespoon of honey, that I would use 1.25 cups of flour. So let's take a second to pause the video here so that you can copy down this slide. So now that we know what this constant of proportionality is, or this unit rate, again, it tells me that we can multiply any amount of honey by 1.25 to find the amount of flour that's needed. So now that I have that tip, let's go back to my original table in my student companion and let's just check our work. Because remember, I can figure out the answers now that I know what the unit rate is. So let's just double check my work so that when we submit this assignment for today for classwork, that we have everything correct. So once again, when we had to figure out how much 13 tablespoons of honey, we can now figure out how many cups of flour because all I have to do is multiply 13 by 1.25 to figure out how much flour I need. So let's just go back to my table and make sure that my answers are correct. We'll pause the video here for just a second. All right, now that we've gone back to our student companion and checked our work, let's keep moving along with today's lesson. So here's just the vocabulary word wall that I wanted to share with all of you guys, just to kind of explain the different things that we have here. Now, we want to make sure that we're recapping our academic language that we've demonstrated in today's lesson to this point, because moving forward, it's extremely important that we're using the vocabulary that's given to us. We've talked about constant of proportionality, what it means to be proportional, um, and different things of that nature, and also have given you different models. So, what I will make sure that I do is moving forward in our Google Classroom, there will be a space in the classwork section that has a vocabulary word wall. So I'll upload this slide to Google Classroom so that you always have reference to this type of academic language. Okay. So now it's evaluation time, and our evaluation activity for today is entitled Quarters and Dimes. So your evaluation is essentially your exit ticket. So we're going to go back to our student companion and we're going to the last page, which is page 4, and there are 3 questions in a table that you guys are responsible for answering. So it's imperative that you complete the table and answer the questions below. It says 4 quarters are equivalent or are equal in value to 10 dimes in this problem. So for 4 quarters, I have 10 dimes. So again, in your exit ticket, let's take some time to fill out this table and then also answer those 3 questions. We're going to pause the video here and take about 5 minutes to complete the evaluation activity. And just as a hint, this may help you a little bit. For instance, 4 quarters is equal to $1, and 10 dimes is also equal to $1. So that might help you when you're filling out the table. For instance, 1 quarter is worth how much? And so forth. So again, let's complete the evaluation activity. Now, let's review this a little bit for the sake of today's lesson, just to make sure that we completely understand what's happening here. So, I'm going to ask some of you guys to share out what it is that you came up with for your exit ticket. Number 1 says, how many dimes equal the value of 6 quarters? So, if I have 6 quarters, what would the equivalent be in dimes? So let's take a moment and put in the chat or share out what you got as an answer for number 1. We'll take 30 seconds and then I'll share out my answer. So hopefully you realize that the answer to number 1 was 15. If I have 6 quarters, that means that I also have the equivalent of 15 dimes. 6 quarters would be $2.50. If I had 10 dimes, that would also be the equivalent of that amount of money. Number 2 says, how many dimes equal the value of 14 quarters? So if I had 14 quarters, let's think about how much money that is. How many dimes would that be equivalent to? So let's go ahead and share out your answer. You can pause the video here briefly. Okay, now that you all have shared, your answer for number 2 should have been 35. So hopefully those were a little bit easy to kind of figure out. Okay, now remember, we're not going over every single thing because we haven't completely filled out the table, or I didn't tell you everything just yet. But let's also answer number 3. Number 3 says, what value belongs next to the 1 in the table? And what does this mean in the context? So let's take some time to share out how you figured out from the table how to figure out the value that goes next to number 1. So let's pause the video here. Let's share out strategies, and let's also share out your answers. Okay. So after your discussion and putting your answers in the chat, hopefully that you guys realize that the number of dimes, or this number that goes next to the 1 in my table, should have been 2.5. And that 2.5 means that 2.5 dimes are worth the same amount as one single quarter. And one way that I could have figured that out is taking my 4 and dividing it by itself, or dividing it by 4 to get to 1, because I wanted to find that unit rate, or that constant proportionality. So if to go from 4 backwards to that 1, I divided by 4, because 4 divided by 4 is equal to 1. So that means I need to do the same thing for 10. 10 divided by 4 doesn't come out to a whole number, but 10 divided by 4, if I did it the long way or put it in a calculator, 10 divided by 4 gives me 2.5. So that's how I found my unit rate, or my constant proportionality. So once again, that 2.5 means that 2.5 dimes are worth the same amount as a single quarter. So let's just revisit what our goals were for today. Do I understand these terms? Remember, I needed to understand what proportional relationship meant. I also needed to understand constant of proportionality. We wrote both of those definitions down in our journals, and we want to make sure that we have a working knowledge of that. We also want to make sure that I can use a table to reason about two quantities that are in a proportional relationship. Okay, give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down to see if we kind of have a working knowledge, or a little bit of an understanding about this new information that we talked about today. Okay. So today's independent activity that's also going to be found in Google Classroom is green paint. That is what your independent activity is for today, and that is due at 11:59 p.m. tonight. So day 1 is done. I know it might have been an extensive lesson for today, but let's just recap really, really briefly. So one of the main things that I need you to do right in this moment is submit your student companion. Let's make sure that all of your answers are complete. We're going to pause the video right here, and I want you to go back to Google Classroom and turn in your student companion. Okay, this is how you're going to get credit for today's activity. Moving forward, there are going to be days where we use student companions in class, and that's how you're going to get your classwork grade, to make sure that you're actively participating and engaged in the live lessons. For those students that are not present on Zoom or in class, you will not be getting your classwork grade because you're not going to have the reference for the student companion. Okay, so we're going to pause the video here so that you can submit the student companion in Google Classroom. Now that you've submitted the student companion in Google Classroom, we're going to talk about the independent activity once again. The activity is called Green Paint. And again, it's located in Google Classroom. It's a Google Doc activity similar to what we did in class. Hopefully, it's going to be just as simple, and you guys are going to complete that today by 11:59 p.m. And last but not least, we are still in a global pandemic. Make sure that you're keeping your distance from your friends and people that don't live in your household. Continue to be safe, and we cannot wait to see you all again tomorrow, bright and early, or after lunch for class. Have a great rest of your day.